Hello everyone, today we talk about unarmored hoplites in a context that even in here, as we will see, it's difficult properly to mostly to extend over time, because we make this video actually essentially from the time of the Peloponnesian War, and we don't know into Hellenistic warfare eventually as it comes to develop how much certain tactics, certain combat units were specifically employed in which scale, in which in which specific army as well, right? Given the broader transformations of what it would have been, properly classical warfare, classical hoplitic warfare, for what it remained, even in parallel to Hellenistic warfare, right? Already this introduction should require a long explanation, because we never made a video specifically on the, we can't say even properly this transition in an evolutionistic sense from classical politic warfare, Iphicratean reforms, and Macedonian reforms that are properly something conceptually different from the previous classical warfare, as it entailed the concept of combined arms together with cavalry. That in classical warfare, I'm specifying here, obviously we're talking about Hellenic classical warfare, was present, but as you know, not in such a determinate quota. Even in this, there should be an enormous explanation, because we're discovering objectively that even the classical political warfare is being described most famously by scholars like Hansen, sometimes some year ago, I think I even advised you to read this book. Very good, right? Just on certain tactical aspects. Now, it turns out there is a very rigid schematic and properly wrong sometimes explanation of what obligate warfare really was, and it's something that we have started, say, not really to discover now, but we're refining our perspectives on the topic. The main problem with Schwerpunkt now, and that's why this video is fundamentally part of the Hellenistic warfare series, not because these things didn't exist before, these troops, it started emerging more massively, let's say more substantially during the Peloponnesian War, but actually they were already there conceptually since the beginning. Right, and predated, of course, in classical warfare in many ways. And that's where the problem stands, right? That on Schwerpunkt we stopped properly talking about classical Hellenic warfare, and that should be instead very important to do. I actually did it because I didn't have a good manual to follow organically, systematically. In fact, a series that I could organically explain, right, step after step. It's not that I am even, I would talk at length about it. Of course, we made some interesting videos. We made, for example, the one with Battle of Pylos and Sphacteria, incidentally, especially in the latter clash, shows the types of unarmored hoplites and very well in their function and in what conceptually they were. So if you're curious, for example, that's one of the few videos that I did at the beginning about Hellenic classical warfare. But today we also have to approach the problem of where did those models go in Hellenistic times, right? And even in here we haven't made a video that explains the whole process. So you will forgive me for certain steps. It's not that I will give for granted that you know what I'm talking about, but at least I'm going to stop making these punctualizations just to make you understand better what we're talking about. And actually, I hope this video to be very, very, very short, right? I will try, because it's not that there is this astonishing much to say about it, right? Unarmored hoplites were a thing out there. Of course they were, right? In many ways, not just because of the anti-skirmishing specific function we'll be seeing today. There is a problem that with the spread of peltasts since the Peloponnesian War, that, as you know, breaks fundamentally the boundaries of amatorialism and seasonalism in Hellenic warfare, and therefore brings to the expansion of these professional forces, including mercenaries, of course, that were coming from different military cultures compared to the Hellenic one. It was also kind of variegated on its own, right? When we talk about classical hoplitism were fundamentally in really talking just about Athens and Sparta, right? And of course, there were lots of other cities around that were similar to that, but already if you start going places like Aetolia or Boeotia and so on, you will realize actually that they were not quite the same thing. There wasn't, classical hoplitism, as we explained a lot of times, especially more if talking about Roman warfare and debunking the myth that the Romans ever adopted as any other people outside the Hellenic motherland, and even this specific cities, classical hoplitism, then in fact talking about Hellenic warfare. There are lots of misconceptions, of course, about this still at a popular level, I would say. Historiographically speaking, now we are going past beyond that. And what's classical hoplitism? Also, is it a mirage? In part, yes, because if we were to actually describe a specific battle in which you said, what would the model that we have created of classical hoplitism worked like, we would never find that specifically. We'll find, of course, something largely overlapping, but never quite in the full, ideal theoretical use of it. Right? These battles, of course, every battle is different from another. Doesn't matter in which context, but tactics are too, and we should understand there even what hoplitic combat was concretely about, right? And abandoning this seducing idea of the Reganian, we could say, hoplitism that was spread in the 80s in this wave of renewed interest towards also the experience of battle, but that it starts to be quite old now, at least given what we started to learn just recently, or to reconsider, right? And the reasons naturally are very ideological. Even if we do not realize it, you would think, what's there ideological in discussing what a classical fighter worked like on the field. Well, there is actually, and there is because it's in the preconceptions that that are brought on the table for the discussion that already start from certain assumptions that are not to be given for granted, and that's where the thing really doesn't work. But for what unarmored hoplites are concerned, we could say naturally that since the beginning of classical warfare, these troops existed alongside the heavier hoplite that, as you know, especially at the beginning, it was concretely on average heavier, right, than it would become later, for a number of reasons and especially those guys who fought in the first ranks, right, and were properly still very connected to a past that had a very few to do with the democratic republican idea that we have of the Hellenic polis, right, and that were absolutely obsessed. This is actually the right word about and terrifyingly about an aristocratic style of warfare. Not that they actually carried that out practically, because of course the Hellenic polis is born from more democratic context, but still from a cultural point of view and in the terms of how these societies also work. We don't have to think about a state, as we know it, we don't have to there's an embryo of that, but the reality of warfare is largely still it comes from an individualistic background, right? And we could talk endlessly about what this practically means on the field, right? There is this sense of citizenship that is forming along the ranks of probably of the political body of the city, right? That fights with this privilege of going armed on the field in these blocks that were we to make finally a video on classical political tactics, we would see we're not so rigid or monolithic or compact as it's usually portrayed, especially in combat proper, right? The formation was there, of course, and these units fought in a thickly packed formation, but there was a lot of exception to that, and in part these unarmored hoplites we study now, like 200, some century later, from whatever this system had begun to develop, begin to appear are actually, in a more functional sense, are actually the not a novelty, right? There was always around this body a lot of troops equipped with lighter, in a lighter fashion, mostly skirmishers, also light cavalry and so on. But we know also of hoplites that technically fought sometimes with javelins as well, with axes. This is something that is overlooked, but we know it actually pretty well. And in fact, we should properly realize that a certain type of this classical war is hoplitism is really coming to full maturity by the 5th century, right? So from a moment that is actually late and that previously contemplated these much more individualistic forms of combat in many ways. By the Peloponnesian War, this thing starts changing for a number of reasons that we listed before, and we start seeing properly hoplites that are regularly employed in this fashion, which actually doesn't tell us much about who these people were usually. There are just hypotheses, conjectures. For example, from a political and social point of view, the most famous employment of these troops is indeed in the Spartan army. That was, by the way, the one that had, from a strictly tactical point of view, like the greatest problems to cope with the new type of warfare that was forming. It was actually designed exactly to knock out the Spartan models, right? The Spartan model as such, right? So the idea of making the Spartan phalanx more, more, let's say, flexible in the sense that it was accompanied, in fact, by these other kind of troops, as we'll see in a while, might have been actually also the helots in part. And we know that during the Peloponnesian War, actually large bodies of them were employed alongside the Spartan phalanx. It was becoming ever, too few to be effective in a broader strategical sense. But this is another problem. We made actually a video about the Spartan army between the 4th and the 2nd century BC, and we have seen also how the Spartans would fundamentally undergo a severe crisis after the 4th century, and that they actually achieved to build over time a remarkable system. Was actually modeled out after the Macedonian phalanx actually, but that's a video that you can look at in, I don't even remember the name of the playlist. I think there is something specifically about Hellenic warfare called like that. And this is also what we have to start taking into consideration, that is an unarmored hoplite. They're witnessed, right? First of all, let's state the evidence for this. There is, for example, the tale of Lysas from Tegea in Arcadia. This guy died in the late 4th century in Attica. He may have been a mercenary. There is no record actually of Arcadian state forces there at the time, right? And we have also the Nereid monument, right? There are these Boeotian, reliefs that show many unarmored hoplites, also for later terms, because that's where the temporal problem starts happening. Is that that historiographically speaking, the passage from classical Greece to Hellenism is presents a darkening of our understanding of what was happening, because the middle classes entered in crisis in a way. They started writing less, or at least in an ever more depending fashion. So we don't have the beautiful Hellenic historiography from the 5th, 4th century, where the thing starts already changing. For example, BC, we start having we know definitely much better the classical Hellenic phalanxes for this reason that, for example, the Macedonian ones. Largely, we basically know almost nothing about the Macedonian phalanxes, how they worked, whatever their attack, because those who participated to it were just a bunch of essentially of no ones, right? Hired by a state-like power, by a monarchy that brought them down, and they were usually like a bit the Marian mules, right? They were just proletarians, poor people. Whereas, of course, the Greeks of the Persian wars were something very different at that point. They were citizens looking at their own community, participating to it actively in politics, as in war, right? And they had an important part in their society. So this influences historiographically, sadly, but still usefully, because these changes occurred a lot of times in history. I personally study the end of the 13th and first half of the 14th century in my work, and that's a moment, for example, in history which starts happening the same exact thing. There are a lot of interesting parallelisms. You can find it even in Roman history, as we were saying before. But we start stopping to understand what were the fundamental changes, right? As long as classical times are concerned, the Iphicratean reforms, the Macedonian reforms, we start understanding what they were about, why they happened, why in that context, why in that time, on the base of which needs and function. After Alexander, or rather even just before that, but when they properly also the thing expands far beyond Greece, we start knowing dramatically less. And as a consequence, by the way, this also happens in Greece too, as we've seen, and therefore we do not know up to the Roman conquest, fundamentally, where, of course, were still local militias afterwards in Greece, in the Hellenistic world, that had been conquered, but that didn't have much of an effective, they weren't effective troops anymore in terms of of armies and broader military systems. We have difficulties. So, and it's a long time. It's a couple of centuries. We're talking essentially this one between the 4th to 2nd century BC. How much of the previous classical warfare actually survived? Because we do know that hoplites did exist. It's just and the phalanx and the thing it's not always the same thing, right? There is not just as we have at this point repeated countless times in all the Roman warfare videos, for example. You don't need to fight as an hoplite just because you have a hoplitic panoply, right? But it's obvious that we were talking about Greece specifically. That was an area that fundamentally had developed that kind of warfare, and we wondered, I don't know how much Athens did. So we will see this actually in some detail of the old-fashioned hoplites standing, and how much were just a copy of Macedonian phalanx. I don't remember where in Athens actually there was that, because it didn't happen elsewhere. In Sparta it did happen. In Athens, I think I don't remember that. I should check that out, but we will see that, because we will make a video on the Athenian army organization during this time, and how many were the famous Tureophoroi that actually took over, as you know, was the prevalent type of trooper. But now that we mentioned the Tureophoroi, that I presume you know what we're talking about, this kind of essentially medium, it depends. They were actually segmented also. They were kind of elite Tureophoroi as well, kind of almost heavy infantry in some ways. But the majority were middle, when not more prevalently medium light infantry, right? Light infantry, a lot of, and even in here, we should make the usual disclaimer saying not everything that you find in the sources this is not a video game. If your historical understanding of this thing is from Total War games, just know that the ancient authors didn't call units in the same way. In a roster in a video game with units in a video game is called. Like when you find a certain term applied to describe a unit, this has a very few to do with your understanding, your certainty about which kind of troops they actually were, right? There were peltasts, for example. They were literally hoplites, right? Essentially of the heavy type. The Tureophoroi look dramatically similar in some ways to certain forms of trooper that is not necessarily the unarmored hoplite in here, but in which, in fact, the latter could even fit by a certain standard that accompanied the phalanx, or even fought within its ranks. And this is the thing that is documented, as we will see in a while, at a certain levels. And generally speaking, there is a graduality in this lightening, heavening of the type of trooper that we cannot precisely track out there, right? It changes, what changes really here is also the modality of participation to wars, right? This time, leagues were the most, the sympolitheia, right, was the most common form of political and military cooperation, right? And it's dramatically close to the 13th or 14th century. I'm sorry, but with my mind, from 3 years, I'm always there every day. So I can't help but notice the striking differences, striking similarities, that actually exist, right, in many ways. So that what meant is that these were mercenaries that were paid. All these city-states put a certain amount of money in common, right? And they paid for mercenaries that technically, in part they were also, of course, troops sent by the city and equipped by the city and trained by the city of citizens proper, and especially the nobility. These, oligarchic figures, they also made a career in the army. All this world we know from, think about Polybius of Megalopolis, his alleged career, military career and expertise, which is in part is debatable, especially the latter, as contrarily to what is commonly said. On other occasions, also, when, I don't know, a major kingdom like Macedonia, for example, it is just at least the closest one to Greece, to these Greek city-states, asked for help, what normally happens is they wanted money, right? They didn't need the actual guys from the city to be sent as contingents. Sometimes it happened, like usually, but usually actually it was just money, and which is dramatically easier, just even in terms of equipment hiring. It's much more centralized, economical, and so on. So there would be other things to say. For example, the fact that aside, I think, from a bunch of troops from, I think, on the Ptolemaic side of Belgraphia, that there is none of the Hellenistic context any mention of mercenary pikemen. That was a thing that we have explained many times in the videos dedicated to Hellenistic military organization, for which the phalanx, the Macedonian style, could exist only thanks to a kingdom or an empire, right? And this is typical also of other contexts that could, you have to spend an enormous fortune, of course, a single city-state couldn't afford to have an effective, enough numbers, because usually speaking, the effectiveness of the pikeman armies is related to that, but also, of course, mostly about their intensive collective training, which costs an astonishing lot. It entails a distribution of the land, the creation of a specific class of troopers. It's something that here really exceeds the boundaries we're looking at, because even though hoplites still did exist, actually, think about the Upas Pistae of the Antigonids, or wherever other Hellenistic kingdom created that corps, were equipped pretty much like this. They were unarmored, you could even say naked in terms of the absence of proper armor. Hoplites, fighting as such, even as a more mobile force, and their importance, even tactically speaking, is not just there to cope with skirmishers. On the contrary, there's even a more active role in the field, outflanking, things like that. We don't know dramatically about it, because even about these units, we don't even know concretely how they were composed. And once again, I'm mostly doing medieval warfare stuff, as you know, but there is an enormous amount of videos we still have to do to set the ABC of all this stuff, Hellenistic warfare, and we do it just every once in a while. So that's why I wish I had done more, so that the basis you could look at if you're interested in these topics, or if you don't know about them. I presume some of you actually have a pretty solid understanding of this stuff, but could be useful. But we're talking chiefly about a world that now is more or less wherever it was kind of a mono city-state, or at least, if not mono city-state, but at least, a city-state that, was pretty much about its own district and maybe some other city, but, as Athens or Sparta could be, but mostly in this chiefly Hellenic area, right, of the Aegean, something presumably also beyond, but, if you're talking about Syracuse, today we will not talk much about the Italiots or Siciliots for that matter, but that was already something more advanced. But if you take even something more far away, it's still like a city-state like Massalia in southern Gaul, or if you look at the Crimean, Bosphorus, if you, all these city-states existing also on the northern and western coast of Asia Minor were Greek properly. You find still this hoplitic type that is, however, dramatically variegated, and you can't understand sometimes what's the boundary between like a lightly equipped hoplite and like a Tureophorus. Objectively, right? There is a moment in which you can't properly distinguish that, and instead these troops actually might have been, especially in this time, as far as we understand, way more present, right, than we think. When you're talking about unarmored hoplites, also we mostly think of properly the trooper of the city-state, right, or something that was hired at least from a Hellenically civilized context, right, as the Tureophorus in that sense could be most usually a foreigner. Think about all the myriads of peoples of the Anatolian hinterland who were used in that sense. I mean, was literally plenty of these troops from everywhere in the Balkans, in Asia Minor, in the Caucasus. I mean, literally everywhere, and it was pretty much the standard of, perhaps Western Europe had some tougher infantries on average for sure, but all this broader Eastern Mediterranean area, even consistent part of North Africa and of also the Middle East were plenty of these troops. So in there, it's also very difficult to understand specifically what we're talking about. Always given, of course, forget that there's no categorical distinction, right? There is always, this is just a shaded. It's a matter of different proportions, but the same type of trooper existed pretty much in the entire world. What's the point of this? Well, the point of this all, and it's not. We could start from Sparta actually, because Sparta. The Spartans were considered, in a certain sense, the inventors of the lighter equipment to court, right? In an hoplite context. Once again, even the concept of Tureophorus, people think that this is usually I know the story. It's the Tureophorus. It's because of the Celtic or Italic shields that came into the Balkans and Greece during the 70s of the 3rd century BC, either because of the Celtic invasion of Greece or the Italic campaign of Pyrrhus against Rome, with other Italics around. So that's where it comes from. Actually, if you read certain sources, you realize that the concept of the Tureos was there since a very long time before. Right? Since the time of Pericles, it was at least conceived in that function. This lighter shield that could be coupled together with a lighter equipment, like the Greeks, this is very important to stress, gave an enormous importance to their shields. Like almost all Hellenic units were called after the name of shields. Like instead the Roman units are called after the weapon, right? And this already tells you, by the way, the completely different mentality between the two military cultures. But the idea, for example, of blocking, in the mountains of Attica, between Attica and Boeotia, the invading armies by sending lighter troops from Athens itself, because that's what they were, there was this advice at the time, to block the passages, right? To block where. Famously enough, if you have read Xenophon, you perfectly know what we're talking about. But the idea that, of course, the hoplite, once it's out of formation, it's terrifically vulnerable, right? And mountain passes were the hoplite nightmare, and that's where skirmishers could take it down. Every kind of hoplite in many ways. And in that context, the example was taken not from other, where the Tureos eventually would come, which, by the way, the Greek Tureos that it was eventually imported, presumably, or allegedly, actually, because of the very reasons we're explaining now, either by the Celts or by the Italics, was anyhow much smaller than the Celtic or the Italic one in Hellenic war or Hellenistic at that point warfare, right? So there is even here a great change, and what the source we're talking about, which is Xenophon himself in the Memorabilia, by the way. It's the third book, I think, 25-28, when Pericles is asked, in fact, what the Mysians and Obsidians against the great king of Persia were able, like, to maintain their autonomy, like, by essentially blocking the Persians in Anatolia. Within in this rugged terrain, like the one that was so similar to the one in Boeotia, right? And Pericles says, yeah, this is very important, because we see there that, of course, the idea was present, right, from quite a time, right? The same Peltasts of the Iphicratean reform, for example, do not have to be confused with the Peltasts that we were saying before, that the same Iphicrates guided to the victory against the Spartans at Lachaeum in 390 BC, or the ones of the Peloponnesian War, because, as we've seen, the first one were hoplites, the latter were properly skirmishers, right? And it's very funny when you read those deadliest warriors, think, which is the greatest warrior? Like, is it, the Spartan warrior? Is it the Roman legionnaire? Right? You take, if you want to knock down a Spartan warrior, all you take is a peltast, actually. You don't have to ask a Roman legionnaire, right? In the proper moment, as warriors asymmetric by definition, you can't knock them down. And there are these military contexts are actually a pretty good example of that. Even the Battle of Pylos and Sphacteria is beautiful. The one of Sphacteria, especially, where that shows this, where the Spartans were, not literally decimated, but obliged eventually to surrender because we were knocked down by skirmishers coming from all sides. This was the great problem of the phalanx, and this is what started happening while Greek armies began to stop being just seasonal things, and the strategical theater operations began to extend dramatically, and they went fighting even in territories that weren't the Peloponnese, weren't Attica, weren't homeland, and also the peoples they started fighting against were not the usual ones. So, and that's why I feel so sad. I wish I had done, a proper video on classical hoplite tactics before making this. But sticking to the topic, the Spartans are credited as the first Greeks to create. It's not even a specific type of unit, but it's specific hoplites that were designed within the ranks to chase peltasts. Psiloi or toxota. What's the peltast is basically and the psiloi actually also were skirmishers, right? The peltasts are broadly meant the psiloi are like we made a video about them. They're just like the throwaway troops. They could be just a slave, right? They're so cheap and they're completely unarmored. They just have darts and they throw that. The toxotai were the archers in practice, but they were all mixed together with the phalanx, by the way, in some cases. We have an evidence, for example, from the same Asclepiodotus, by the way, that speaks of the insertion of files of psiloi between the hoplite files of the phalanx, right? They're called parentaxes, by the way. And that isn't even specifically, remember those troops we were talking about before that were around the phalanx, mostly trying to, the lighter troops, skirmisher, or even mounted sometimes, that were around the phalanx trying to harass the enemy. They were a reminiscence also of Homeric warfare, we could say, because the warrior, the heavier trooper, has always gone there with someone supporting him from the rear or from the flanks in some way. This was a bit the same thing where the hoplitic phalanx had fully formed historically and voting like that. And we can think that throughout all the time of the previous centuries, these skirmishers had been there, right? There is not properly or necessarily a moment in which someone invented that these guys could even be interspersed among the hoplitic ranks. You could say, but the hoplitic ranks weren't so particularly compact, nobody could pass through. Well, that's exactly what we were talking about at the beginning. Actually, it's a bit different, right? Aside from the fact that, of course, different units have, a space that separates them, and these are just these other lighter troops do not fight in formation. They're all scattered, so they can run back and forth. It was absolutely normal in every kind of army at the time. But the point we're making here is that probably this was not kind of a too new idea. It was rather about the fact that, as we were saying before, the injection of a greater amount of mercenaries were actually specialized in this. Think about the agrarians or the Thracians, etc., that will, in fact, even in the equipment, bring some innovation within the Hellenic equipment. Talk about clothing, even things like boats, as we will say now, would make, on specific terrains and specific circumstances, geopolitical life very hard, right? The Spartans were the ones that found out the hardest in this regard. Also, there is all a broader political and social problem that now we can't properly address, but that fundamentally the Spartans had up to the 70s or the 4th century BC the unchallenged superiority over the other Greeks, simply because they were the ones that invested the most in training, and in part presumably also in equipment, probably not so necessarily actually, but they were the ones that remained for up to that point more traditionally oriented towards the idea that at the end of the day it was just the phalanx that had to do the work done, and the Peloponnesian War is in many ways the attempt to try to surpass this from the other Greeks that entailed the injection in the phalanx of all these other together with the phalanx of all these other elements aside the phalanx, we could say, besides the phalanx, that were other people from a political and social point of view. They were also sometimes foreigners, as we've seen. And therefore, this means that in parallel, the same phalanx actually starts losing importance in some ways. There are also other mixed systems, like the Boeotians also are simply poorer. They can't have such a strong phalanx like the Spartan one, also for a matter of equipment and also time of training. But they are a lot, and as you know, they will defeat the Spartans after simply beating them on where they were the best. That is, where they were fast, since they trained the most compared to the other Greeks. They simply performed their maneuvers on the field more quickly, and this is what gave them dramatically the edge on the other Greeks. So what do the Boeotians think is that, let's run all together en masse, doesn't matter how orderly, against these guys. Well, they make the maneuver, and let's overwhelm them before they can order. And that's how, the Spartan phalanx enters in crisis, together with a world political and social system at that point, right? In the meanwhile, other stuff is happening with the Epicuretian reform, with the lightening of the troops, with the fact that there were lots of troopers that now could equip more easily, right? That wherever, whereas the rest of the citizenry didn't even want to fight at some point. So there is probably a different participation in the army, in the political military leaders' extraction. So that's also in many ways the road that starts paving the rise to a wholly professional and non-citizen model. There was the Macedonian one. That is, however, conceptually very different from the Hoplite thing, because technically, as we've seen before, it doesn't, not even because of the Epicuretian reform, you can think that there was a direct connection between the classical Hoplitic warfare and the Macedonian phalanx, because that was properly conceived on a different tactical idea. It was the one of combined arms in the latter case, and that required a feudal society like the Macedonian one to field enough heavy cavalry, was the strongest in Europe, and in many other ways, at least in sedentary Europe, and that's the pattern we should think. So the Spartans, are even thought at some point to have stopped for, between the 404 BC to 371, allegedly, to even stop all armor, to big even for infantry, right? Just pillas helmets that, as you know, is this lighter form, also in felt or in bronze. That become and around Aspis shield, their only protection basically to hurt themselves against the enemy missile troops too, right? Because if the idea is that my phalanx is exposed, it's vulnerable, they're attacking me from the flanks or from the rear. Now in these new battlefields that emerge, start occurring from the Peloponnesian War onwards. I don't sit there just maintaining cohesion. I need to send other troops to take out the skirmishers, and I have to be as light as them if I want to take them down, right? This is very important. So hence this idea of the unarmored hoplite, the ektoromos, right? Also as it is called, right? And it's particularly important because the Spartans suffered devastating defeats at the hands of this new tactics with peltasts. There is include specifically Sphancteres I mentioned it before, not just because I made the video, but it's because objectively it was one of the most important, fascinating of these ones. And there's also particular gear to start appearing. For example, the Thracian boots, right? And these boots seem to have been probably a remnant of the Spartan campaigns in Macedonia, where the ektoromoi hoplites, so these lighter hoplites, fought against the Thracian peltasts that had been hired there by the Athenians, right? And so much that in fact they took the name of the general as they were known as Brasileioi, as type of boots, specifically because they came, at least in the memory, from that occasion where this Thracian element had been adopted. There was probably from the same Sparta, or however, throughout through this through Athens as well, right? Presumably, if the Athenians had hired these guys, we know some Thracians also were brought in Attica and so on. So this thing began to spread also there. That partly the Iphicratean reforms began to be employed. For example, the ratio 6:1 that we find in the Iphicratean army in 392 BC between hoplites and peltas force, right, that overwhelmed the Spartan hoplite detachment with its lighter missile troops, even if it still needed heavy troops to finish off the wounded Spartans, by the way, right? Because in all of this, the Spartans were courageous. If you look at the Battle of Sphacteria, we also know that, of course, at the end they surrendered, but basically they managed to get across all the island, targeted from all sides and smoked by the enemy fires without water. I mean, in this devastating situations, maintaining their formation. Right, the Spartans did that the entire life. That's all the thing they knew how to do, and that was fundamental. It was a reason of being. It's a bit like conceptually what the Prussians in the 18th century that preferred not to run against the enemy if by breaking the line, even if they could overwhelm it easily, but they would take all the musketry fire to remain at the same pace and getting lots of deaths, sometimes even losing the battle. Right, for the point that they were Prussians and they fought like that. Well, this is similar. Albeit also the idea of Spartan traditionalism is a bit, overly emphasized. Actually, the Spartan military was fairly flexible throughout all this. They weren't stupid. They wouldn't get themselves killed. It's just that their political and social system at that point wasn't contemplating much of the injection of other elements to perform the specific duties. Though, right, we can think that the actually, since the beginning, part of the Macedonian veterans that had fought against the Thracians of the Athenians, so to use it in these terms, might have actually been Helotai, right? In the sense that, for a Spartan, it might have seemed to be, maybe in Sphacteria, they were obliged to do that, but in that other context, said, a Spartan shouldn't be doing this, should be chasing skirmishers, it's wasted. So let's hire Helotai, right? And and let them campaign, until Macedonian, bit back the Athenians there. And the survivors of the Macedonian campaign came back also to the Peloponnese, and they were given in return for their service freedom and land plots, right? Lots of helots actually were being employed at this point. There were the famous the Modes, right? That probably made part of this Brasileioi, veterans. The Neodames were essentially helots who, for extraordinary service rendered, were granted their freedom in return, right? And there is, even in this context, naturally a more conventional, traditional use of the helot as like kind of attendants, field aides of the Spartan warriors. But it's been suggested that actually during the Peloponnesian War, most of the campaign detachments of Sparta were, in their majority, helots themselves. Maybe a few perioikoi, these other freemen that inhabited in the Peloponnese, but a bit at the margin. They're a bit mysterious figures, but they lived at the margins of the Spartan world, as technically, subjected, but still autonomous in realities, not like the helots that were within this, slavery. The Spartans were the greatest enslavers, let's say, of the ancient world in many ways, for the specific functionality that gave to slavery in this, for the world system, generally speaking, and the support of the Spartiates proper. And so there were also other units, foreigners started being hired even in there, right? And in this context, it's possible perfectly that the majority of the also lightening of the armor occurred, right? There was naturally something happening at the same, as we've seen, at the same Spartiatus level in this regard, because after all, in a political warfare at that time, as we have seen before, Lauter, it was mostly about maneuvering, about collective trading that the fight was won, right? The Spartans were, as far as we know, the only Greeks that were specifically trained in sword combat, at least on a regular base, in a semi-professional way, because also the Spartans weren't, sure, they were the best of the Greeks, but there is no comparison between the individual training of a Celt or of an Italic or whatever, and a Spartan war. No comparison at all. Of course, the tribal reality was dramatically more intense, more complete, more dynamic. There is no doubt about this. But as far as the Greeks were concerned, when fighting against each other, of course, the most important thing was, let's outmarch them, let's outmaneuver them. We win. Right? It's that easy, right? You don't need more. That's good enough to win. That's why the Athenians didn't want to face the Spartans in open field, because they knew they couldn't stand, right, their force on a regular base, right? So this is really the point. We do know that also from Xenophon that this practice was that happened. There were troops that, specifically the younger soldiers, this is an important part, were ordered to break ranks and pursue the light armed troops. Like in all armies at the time, the younger people were the ones deputed, for obvious reason, to skirmish, because they were fastest and more elastic, let's say. They were the ones that still had to prove, also in this pretty dangerous situation in many ways, that's where the young people are easy. There are things that to an 18-year-old soldier you can't ask that a 30-years-old will never do, because you say, oh, come on, man, I will not do it. There's probably also a proper idea of extreme violent competition in this sense. They wanted to prove themselves to be the more mature warriors would also, of course, make the bulk of the phalanx were steadier, cooler, colder in many ways, and even stronger, from practice, etc. But this thing was normal. So here we even have properly certain hoplites from the phalanx, according to Xenophon, that carried this out. Now, at that point in history, but even before, technically what the Homeric in previous centuries, the pre-classical times had been, was fundamentally about this. The hero that also comes out of the phalanx of the group, however, in which he fights. That the term phalanx also in Greek is very elastic, has nothing encyclopedically categorical as we were saying at the beginning. It's just the heavy infantry formation. In fact, the Greeks called the same of any other people fighting like that, without that having the slightest to do with, hoplitic warfare, hoplitic tactics. It was a pretty generic thing. And I'm not saying that those younger Spartans in that case were necessarily were fighting with the same idea, or better, with the same function, right? Of course, heroic combat contemplates that the hero is the toughest guy ever, extremely well equipped, and goes on to face the enemy face to face. Very romantic idea, never quite existed 100% in the same in warfare. Religious judicial duels are another thing, and of course there is a conviction of the two, but we know that in warfare proper there is no evidence of that, systematically speaking. These younger guys were just instead thought now in a much more secularized context as properly something between the hoplite and the skirmisher, so not like the hero, but still as young men, still thinking they were the heroes of the situation, right? That would go out of the phalanx doing this stuff and, feeling, showing that they were, cool and, bold and the stuff. It was an extremely risky business, by the way, right? Because enemy javelins bit hard, right? And the concept here is naturally is that the hoplite is unarmored. Of course, is even more vulnerable to the enemy fire. In fact, these guys usually didn't even have, before we were talking about the smaller aspis, but some technically had the oplum probe, right? This is quite important to stress also the fact that you don't need the oplum to necessarily perform, that the oplum is not necessarily to perform just hoplitic function as we imagine it in the classical Hellenic sense, right? There are Celtic warriors with hoplum. There are skirmishers with hoplum, right? So it's a myth, the idea that he was equipped with a hoplum is just, the guy who fights in the way we are used to seeing for the Athenian and the Spartan armies in the classical Hellenic time. And this is particularly important, right? Because it's not just a matter, the shield by that was used in a way more dynamic way we were used to think, even in hoplitic combat, right? We know of, very different tactics from the ones just of the wall, of the guys that just kind of try to stab each other from the top overarm grip, right? That's is the view that we have, stressed from the times, a few generations ago, and now it turns out probably they didn't fight like that at all. You say, how, why? I learned that. I was sure it was. Well, I can assure you that at this point, we think that they fought like that only if it was necessary, right? And for the rest, it was actually a much more dynamic back and forth movement of waves of hoplites and doing the stuff in the front, exactly because these guys were obsessed, like the whole ancient world ever since about the Iliad, about the idea of the individual heroism, right? It doesn't matter that an Athenian hoplite, of course, was just an amateur of war. That hoplitism, properly speaking, actually emerges from a non-professional type of warfare. And in fact, in terms of ancient world standards, it's not this big deal at all, right? Not even in the case of the Spartans, right? But that was functional for their specific Hellenic context, and was meant by non-professionals of war. The Spartans being basically the exception, right? And not even in a fully professional sense. There is in here, again, a lot I would like to add, but it's important to stress that brute force is all it was needed in that sense. There wasn't much of a pregressed training, except for the Spartans once again, but just this way of, of going out there every once in a while to prove something and to stress naturally the importance of the fight, the motivation, the thing, but not much of a specific tactical refinement that starts actually happening from the Peloponnesian War onwards, exactly because now professionalism begins to appear for a very few troops, while the others all basically don't even go to war anymore. A lot of foreigners are being employed as mercenaries, and that's how things start to change gradually. Now, what was also, how can we think an unarmored hoplite to have fought like, concretely, like, was he completely naked? Sometimes, actually, we don't have any way. There were naked troops in Hellenic warfare still at this point. That has some advantages, but also when we think about lighter armored hoplites, we think also hoplites that were light enough, armored enough, but still not in the full, at least heavy hoplite fashion, right? And this entails also probably certain different adaptations of this type of armor, their their composition and so on. Consider that also, for example, what it means to fence off a javelin, or just a sword that's javelin, once it's thrown, it has always that energy, and just it hits on you, and if it makes it through and wounds you, that's it. There is no other extra force. A sword is something very different, because the guy is not just stamping at the moment. He's going to keep pushing inside of you until it breaks through the armor, through the tissues and so on. So it's even this is conceived in all this function, because the extramoid do not have to fight against other in melee combat, right? If not against lighter troops. And it's not necessary to be said either that these troops were particularly well suited to even deal, for example, with I can say elite skirmishers, but other troops that were more prone to, especially the one from barbarian background, to hand-to-hand combat in other ways. And surely they were not even very good at facing other kind of traditionally light infantry. It's possible that Arturophorus actually was actually better at stopping these guys, or more or less at their level, right? However, there is still to say that, of course, a human being is a human being. These guys could be used, mobility sometimes could be more important than protection, as it often happens in warfare. That's also why you would fight naked, if you wonder, among the other things, why. Or just think about fighting under the Hellenic or Near Eastern sun, what it means in summer, right? There is this idea of mobility, for which naturally also in Hellenistic warfare, where we know how also in classical warfare, but classical Hellenic warfare, but importantly also, more importantly, complexively in the Macedonian tactics, how vulnerable the flanks are. And having this kind of lighter troops is very important. And in fact, the same Macedonian hypaspists, for example, we don't have to think, they were elite, yes, but they could fight, the elite is not necessarily always heavy as we mean it. They could also fight very lightly equipped. They could fight as commandos, for example, also in operations of, attacking enemy camps at night, going through swamps, doing stuff that, still as today requires a light equipment. Or just outflanking the enemy, as they were mostly conceived, also because they had enough training in that case for doing it. So here we're talking, as we were saying before, chiefly about the Hellenic world, let's say more or less narrowly meant. The Macedonian troops are something else, but that's still essential in terms of what, as far as equipment is concerned, the same type of trooper, right? And there is this obvious degree of interchangeability of equipment in ancient warfare that you find at every single time. Do you think that Roman legionnaires, for example, always fought with armor on? Of course not. Sometimes they could transform themselves in light infantry storming walls. There's a very interesting passage here from Thucydides, 320, 22, 23, at the siege of Plataea, right? When this was the Spartan siege in 428, 427 BC. So what the Plataeans do is that they broke out of their besieged city during winter, and they used ladders to get over the Spartan wall of circumvallation. So what the Plataean troops assault like is first of all sending this light armed over the top. They took the enemy by surprise exactly through the speed of these light armored troops. The first up the ladders were 12 men armed only with daggers and wearing breastplates. Right. Next came more light armed men carrying spears. Shields were carried only by the men who came up with a third wave. Right. So here we're talking. The first two waves were not of hoplites proper because they lacked the hoplite. But what does tell us that those guys were not maybe, and just also because they had to be specifically reliable in that first assault, maybe guys that would fight and as hoplites in a normal context, right? Naturally, that specific context is also to be realized as, it was mostly about the surprise and getting on the walls in time. So that is a good example that shows not much the unarmored hoplite, but how by itself, but how speed over protection is mobility or protection is important in a specific context like that, and it makes you understand how and why these troops could exist and how they could exist well before the Peloponnesian War brought this greater need to employ lightly armored hoplite to cope with increasing number of peltasts that were being deployed. Right. So this is particularly important to stress. I would like you to get used before we make those other videos that explain the thing better to the fact that there is not like a preset standard of troops equipment that is being used only from a time onwards on a specific time. These things have always been there at every moment. It's just their ratio that varies, it's their function, their possibility of employment that varies, right? These guys are sometimes the same guys that fight also in heavier fashion, right? And it's ever more the case, in my opinion, because we've seen it with the Hypaspistae, that were in many ways the elite of the Macedonian army, at least for what infantry is concerned. And they're exactly that. They can fight in any single type of equipment, in armament and context, because that's what they're thought for, right? That's what you want a commander elite unit to be like. And so, as we were saying before, it's extremely difficult to understand towards the end of this period, between the 4th and 2nd century BC for today's video. These tactics were kind of revived if the Thureophoroi took over this role, because objectively, as far as we understand, let's say traditional political warfare in those states tends to fade, right? It's just we don't know exactly by which measure, right? We often don't know how these various Hellenic city-states were armed like in terms of their military forces. We have some hints of that, and we just see that the tendency to the lightening of the equipment is there. That this is technically what will bring also to other innovations, like the same ones will bring to the Macedonian reforms. The hoplite has now, the soldier now has, the infantryman has, an ever longer spear since the Iphicratean reforms. Allegedly, in that case, 60 centimeters over the normal hoplite spear. Then eventually the phalanges of Macedonian reforms will, it's not even correct maybe to call it reforms, because these were created in Macedonia out of scratch anyway. So as we were saying before, there's no specific connection out of the hoplitic thing, but at that point you have even, the pike is so long, the guy is not even thought to fight in hand-to-hand combat anymore. So what about its equipment, right? It's not necessary, say, from you're protecting the first ranks from the frontal projectiles rain. Rain. It's hail. It's kind of useless, even for both offensive, in fact, equipment aside from the pike is concerned. So it's something you start seeing as the normal business, even for what concerns Hellenistic warfare. All the Turioferi were employed alongside the Fangs. They were always there, even in massive numbers, right? So at that point, why would you conceive a hoplite for doing that stuff when you can simply hire a guy that does it much better in the first place, because he has spent his entire life where he comes from, in the mountains, in the hills, doing exactly that, and the citizenry is ever less employed in warfare in that regard, and if it is, chances are it's on average kind of heavier, right? And so, but also less skilled to carry the tactic out. So this is in many ways representative. Most is something that is highlighted from the Peloponnesian War onwards, mostly in that context, and that probably, in my opinion, survived for a long time. It's just that it might have ended up absorbed by the same exact function by other troops out there. So this is actually all what I wanted to talk about to talk about with you today. And I think that naturally I'm sure there are other hints of this stuff. Not entirely sure. I don't know how much historiography has highlighted this point, but it's important to stress the presence of all these different types of, let's say, of warriors, even in the what we consider still the classical political warfare, and considering that these functions were there already before. They came kind of famous with the crisis of the classical political warfare, with the Peloponnesian War, right? And they kept exist in many ways from many other peoples, many other troops. That's it. We will update on other aspects of this whole thing. Hellenistic warfare is, as you know, one of my favorite topics, and that's why from today, it's like talking about something that belongs to the past more than that. But I'm trying to find a way to restart talking seriously about classical Hellenic warfare. Hellenic classical warfare, I should mess up the order adjectives in English, but that's in many ways the founding moment of certain, at least for the didactic sake of these explanations, that we should point out. Otherwise, someone could feel disoriented regarding to it. But anyhow, for now, I just stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.